This next segment is going to be right up your street. So let's talk about Reform, who of course made a fairly good showing, I think, in the local elections, it's fair to say. But big debate, I think, or if there isn't, there should be, with regard to whether, given that Reform and the Conservatives, you could argue, if you're looking at traditional proper Conservatives, are kind of two sides of the same coin, on the basis that in the local elections, obviously Labour won convincingly, absolutely. However, if you combine the Reform and the Conservative vote, they ended up with about 40% of the vote, which actually was more than the Labour vote at about 37, 38%, correct me if I'm wrong. So surely there's a logic, a common sense to Richard Tice and Nigel Farage and Rishi Sunak and others, Richard Holden, the chairman of the Conservative Party, saying, well, hang on a sec, surely the way to win this election is to combine. So that's the first thing. Should they, will they? I think I know the answer. I think we definitely know the answer from Reform, and we're going to play a clip in a minute where Nigel Farage certainly has something to say about that. But also, on a kind of more local level, let's say that you've got a constituency which is inhabited already by, let's call it a genuinely proper centre-right Conservative. Let's talk about a Steve Baker or a Mark Francois, a Priti Patel, for instance. Should Reform, even though they're running a candidate in that particular constituency in that election, do you think on the basis that they are literally the same coin, let alone two sides of the same coin, should Reform back off?
I think Reform would be very wise to consider this, because their intention is to not do greatly at this election, but to establish themselves as the next involved in. And so I think that it would be a good token on their part towards those Tories that they want to do a deal with one day, allegedly, to go soft on people like Ian Duncan Smith and others who side very much along the same lines as they do. So it would be a shrewd move, I think, tactically to do so.
Let's see what Nigel Farage says about that, though, Trevor, shall we? Just watch this.
Absolutely no interest in working with a group of people who betrayed my personal trust, damaged my personal reputation by actually trusting them in 2019 to do what they delivered. And the reason this election's gone is those red wall voters are not, even if we didn't stand a candidate, those red wall voters who are saying at the moment they'll vote Reform, they would not vote for them. All right.
So, Trevor, pretty decisive for Nigel Farage there.
Yes, and I see his point. After all, they made a complete shambles of Brexit after they scored the victory with his help. But as I say, I think it would be a good idea of his. But what is interesting is only the other day he indicated that he would be prepared to talk to them. Now, what I would like to know is what exactly would he be talking about? What would he want from the Tories?
Is this
what could
before
they
he decided
give?
not to stand as a Member of Parliament?
No, this is only the other day. So, okay. I mean, look, I think there are all sorts of fishing exercises going on here. Rishi Sunak has ruled out any sort of deal, but quite clearly in politics, anything can go at any time.
But didn't the Conservatives and the Lib Dems also rule out deals before the 2010 election? And look what happened. As soon as you become a kingmaker, particularly as a Liberal Democrat who, let's just say, when it comes to government, don't exactly have a track record of being elected to government over the last goodness knows how many decades. I guess the scent of power becomes rather overwhelming the day after the election, doesn't it?
Yes, and in the case of the Lib Dems and the Tories, David Cameron wanted a coalition government before the election. So
yes.
There you are. But,
and we should also, for balance, again, I'm saying the word balance, we should also talk about George Galloway and Labour, though, shouldn't we, in terms of tactical voting?
I mean, George Galloway, the Muslim vote, and the issue of Claire Short and others who are standing now, who are opponents of Starmer, but still under the headline of Labour supporters. All of these will milk votes away from the Labour Party. And I think that at the moment, Keir Starmer is handling this extremely badly. It's probably too late for him to do otherwise, because he's the one who, I think, rather furtively pretended that he didn't know what the outcome of the inquiry into Diane Abbott was, for instance. And then we discovered that it was all sorted back in December. Yeah. So I think that he's fighting this one now for the third day in a row. Now it's taken over all of the agenda on politics at his expense.
And we're going to be talking about Diane Abbott and others a bit later on. And of course the Conservatives have a bit of an uphill climb with regard to even selecting and putting candidates in place. The last number I heard just a couple of days ago was that because of the rush nature of Rishi Sunak unexpectedly announcing the general election, given that he'd already said apparently to many members of Parliament, yeah, go off on a holiday for half term, and then 24 hours later calls an election, and then of course many of those MPs got criticised for being away on holiday during an election time. But there's something like 130 seats that the Conservatives now, particularly with the amount of MPs that are standing down on the Conservative side, that they're yet to select from. That's a big problem, isn't it?
That's a huge problem. I mean, we don't know, and I'm sure they don't know fully, the background of half the people they're going to be putting up as candidates for what is putatively the next government.
Yeah.
So, I mean, an awful lot of big beasts have also left, which leaves gaping holes in the lineup of the front rank of the Conservative Party. And it's going to be a totally changed Parliament. On July the 5th, we're going to find hundreds of Labour MPs that we don't know, and hundreds of Tory MPs, or maybe 100 if they're really in a bad way, who we also don't know.
Yeah.
And that's a big difficulty for the government to sort of bring together a fighting force.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you think that this could be a very tactically voting election? You know, as we said, Conservative versus Reform, two sides of the same coin. To many, Galloway and Labour, particularly, I think you mentioned off mic, the very relevant point around the Muslim vote and where that's going now because of Keir Starmer's standpoint on Gaza. I mean, no matter which way you want to vote, and obviously it's not for us to tell you which way to vote at all, that is entirely a matter for you as the watching and listening public, watching this debate with Trevor and I. But do we think that we are more likely to have a hung parliament than otherwise we might?
I think that was a possibility a little while ago, but the polls are showing pretty steady leads for the Labour Party. Well, no, not entirely, nor does anyone else. But I think that in the past we've had a situation where governments have been unpopular. John Major's government was unpopular in 1997. But there was a residual support for him. And there have been also Labour losses when they've been in the front-running position through months before an election when they've actually lost the election in the final whistle. So it is possible that it'll be a hung parliament, but sadly I think that it's going to be a landslide for Labour.
Okay, well, let's see. A long way to go yet. They say a week's a long time in politics. 4 weeks, therefore, is 4 times as long. So who knows what's going to happen.